Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and hi to everyone who's joining this session. I'm hugely excited to welcome you to the second session of the UCL Beyond Boundaries conference to discuss universities and the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs are of critical importance to UCL and to universities and higher education institutes all around the world. How can we, as a community of researchers, of teachers, as a collection of assets and buildings and brains in places, and as an innovative international public sector ecosystem, respond to these, the world's greatest challenges? My name is Martha McPherson. I'm head of Green Economy and Sustainable Growth here at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. I've been asked to chair this session as a provocative and a challenging discussion. I've got 6 fantastic people here to help me do so. Now is not the time just to sit on our laurels and to be very proud of what we've done in the higher ed sector, engaging with the SDGs. Universities have done amazing work, but it's also time to think through how should we interact, engage, and be activists for Agenda 2030 for the next 8 years. We've got 1 hour, 30 minutes, and we've got 6 expert panelists here with a range of various knowledge and experience from different universities and non-university institutes from around the world. I'm going to introduce you quickly, if everyone can just wave and say hi when I introduce you, and then we'll get down to business. So we've got Adriana Allen from the Bartlett here at UCL. We've got Aromar Revi from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. We've got Phil Baty here from Times Higher Education.
Hello.
We've got Tanya Dudnikova, who's a recent UCL alumna.
Hiya.
We've got Duncan Ivison, who's joining us from his evening in the University of Sydney. And we've got Tristan McCowan from the Institute of Education, also here at UCL.
Great to be here.
Thank you all for coming so much. I'm really looking forward to talking to each of you. So now each of the panelists, we asked them beforehand to put together a 5-minute video before the session to share a kind of opening statement with their thoughts, their challenges, and their concerns. And these videos are really interesting and super kind of well worth watching in full. After the end of this session, they'll be up on the UCL YouTube site, and we'll send the link across. But to start us off, we've snipped together some sections from each to kind of provoke, to set up interest areas and to speak to each other. So we will play that to you now.
I don't think it has ever been as important as it is today to champion the great impact that universities have on our society. Universities have a profoundly positive impact on the world through their educational programs, of course, through their work in the community, through their inventions, their innovations, and through their groundbreaking discoveries. Universities drive regional and national economies. More profoundly, they help us to understand what it is to be human. They make the world a better place. But despite this unquestionable and to me absolutely obvious public good, universities in many parts of the world seem to be under attack. Across the continents, populist politicians are questioning the very worth of our higher education institutions. And perversely, the pandemic has promoted and empowered the forces seeking to denigrate universities.
I think increasingly the community expects us to harness our research in ways that address the really complex, difficult issues that our local community faces, that our country faces, and that our region and the world faces. I think that's a really deep, fundamental shift that's occurring, not only in Australia, but across the world. We just know that whether it's climate change, whether it's global poverty and social dislocation and alienation, whether it's the rise of an impact of technology, of course, things like the global pandemic, we just know that governments, firms, and indeed universities can't address those problems on their own.
Perhaps the question we need to examine is instead, how can universities meaningfully contribute to the SDG process without unintendedly contributing to further injustices? And that is the need to decolonize development and its knowledge base. That is the way we think about development, the actions taken in its pursuit, and the indicators we use to monitor progress. The role of the university in propelling the SDGs is not about providing abstract global solutions. We need to cultivate spaces of and for epistemic justice.
The SDGs are based on an unfounded optimism that the current economic model can help us achieve a just and sustainable world. So we need to question that model. The SDGs also are inattentive to questions of culture, language, knowledge traditions, and those also need to be incorporated into our vision. So I would argue that the university also needs to be at the forefront of helping us reimagine that framework.
I think that UCL has the responsibility to respond to student demands, but more fundamentally, as an authoritative actor in the fields of teaching and research, I think UCL must advance efforts for the SDGs and have an active voice in both national and global sustainability debates. However, there is definitely a limit of what academics can do to drive forward our learning in the classroom when it comes to sustainability. Of course, they do control what happens directly in the classroom, but I think it's equally as important to think of the informal curriculum, what happens outside of the classroom, students' real-life experiences.
Universities have already been and will be increasingly part of not only the implementation of the SDGs on their campuses, I would say that's a relatively easy thing to do, but actually working with the cities and communities in which they're embedded, in the regions and the countries in which they're actually working, to not only influence what's happening in practice just now, but to educate, train and influence a new generation of researchers, of academics, of learners, and activists and practitioners who will make the SDGs possible in the sort of 10 years that we have to make that happen.
Okay, so there's a lot in there to get us started. And also I can just see from the poll that you're sending into us as the audience where you're joining us from today, welcome. There's a huge amount of diversity and different countries represented here, people from Sheffield to Nepal. And we've got about 500 people joining us today. So thank you and welcome to you all. Please do send in questions. We're doing as much as we can to make it feel like a real life conference where you can put up your hand and ask questions. Okay, so there's a lot there to get us started in the video that you guys saw. So to give us some kind of structure to this session, we've split it up broadly into different segments, and these are based on the different roles that universities can take up and are increasingly called to take up in their communities and in the world. And I'll give an example. One of the reasons that I get up in the morning, get out of bed, and why I come to work at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is I feel we hold a really interesting hybrid position and multiple roles. We're a teaching department, we're a research department in a very traditional sense, but we also work to get our hands dirty. We work with governments, with organizations, public and private sector around the world to get our research out there into practice and do what we call practice-based theorizing, learn from the application of research. And the ultimate aim from my point of view is to rethink and to reimagine concepts of what we call value in the economy, what we call public value, what we think of as private value, and how can you reorient these questions of value towards taking on society's biggest challenges, towards the SDGs. So the SDGs as such come into the heart of my everyday work, of our everyday work and of projects. For example, we're working with organizations like the Biscay government in northern Spain on an SDG-oriented tax policy, which is a really interesting world first tax policy. And we're working with governments from Italy to South Africa, some of the countries that you flagged as being from in the poll, to transform these global goals into real, actionable, mission-oriented policy-making tools and set long-term goals, bringing together different sectors, bringing together bottom-up and top-down solutions in our kind of work around innovation and economics. So that's how it affects my everyday life. And I can see I'm really interested to understand what are the different roles of a university. So I think we'll start with a shout out to the audience to get to see ourselves perhaps from the outside. What is the role of a university? What would you say the role is? And there's a poll going up right now that can help you feedback what you think the role of a university is today. I'll just wait a few minutes to get back some answers from the audience before we share them. This is super, thank you so much. There's some really good stuff coming in. So education coming up strongly, not a surprise there. I think that's what people would maybe think of as the traditional role of a university. Innovation's coming in strong, which is really great to hear. That's what I think of as a university's work as well. Public service, global impact, teaching, yes, that makes sense. Transformational change, I like that one. they're all bobbing all over the place. Simulate creative thinking, solve global problems. Okay, well, I'm glad we're all here to think about the university in that kind of context. I think it's really, yeah, it's great to hear so many different answers coming back. And I like the top three we've got really are innovation, research, and education. So let's kind of start with education. I think we'll start with the idea that, you know, maybe it's the most traditional one. You know, universities are teaching and learning organizations. They are rooms full of students. They are rooms full of researchers teaching students. And so I'd really like to start off with a student herself, with Tanya Dudnikova, one of our UCL alumna, and just bring in her kind of point of view to kick us off. So Tanya, what is it, do you think, that students want from universities that are engaging with their SDGs?
Hi there. Yeah, so just to quickly introduce myself, so I just graduated this summer, which was a very, very interesting time to graduate, as you can imagine, and also kind of ties in with a lot of what we're saying, because obviously the pandemic, I think, made me personally, at least, actually rethink the way in which, you know, I think about my education and the role of it, because obviously when you can't have this kind of physical space of university, we're all gathering together in one place, I think it does make you also rethink what is actually the purpose of this, you know, when you are graduating without, actually my graduation is today, and it's going to be an online one. So again, it kind of makes you think, what is the purpose of this, and how is my education actually being impacted when there is no physical place for us all to congregate? But no, Martha, I think that's a fantastic question. And I think, yeah, I think a lot of the audience answers are really, really brilliant, and you're all stealing my fantastic points. I think it is fantastic that innovation is coming up so high. I think, yeah, you know, obviously traditionally we'd say education research, but I think innovation is a really, really important one to consider when it comes to the SDGs, because I think, you know, they invite such a breadth of conversation, and I think the SDGs really like make us think about how everything around us is evolving all the time with things like the pandemic. I think they really invite us to be adaptive to our environment, which I think is where innovation comes in. I think also things like leadership are super important when it comes to the student voice being active and being heard in this kind of SDG debate. So I think what I would expect from UCL as a graduate now is I'd expect them to give me the skills to go away and actually be able to do things like this, which I think is really, really fantastic. I don't know if that's kind of what all new students maybe think about when they're first coming to university, but at least now as a graduate, that's definitely something that's really, really important to me, as opposed to just obviously a normal educational framework where I go away and I get my degree and I get my certificate and that's it.
Thanks, Tanya, and huge congratulations to you and your cohort. I hope you have a good
very much
graduation today, if a little bit unorthodox. Tristan, I want to bring you in here just to kind of respond to this. You're from the Institute of Education. I know you have thoughts more widely than this, but what would you respond to how Tanya's kind of reframing what students want from a university?
Yeah, I think she's made some great points. I mean, it's a really complex thing. Teaching the SDGs. I mean, quite often you see these declarations, that state, well, that's what we need to do. So we just reorient our institutions. It's a really complex thing. I mean, conventionally, we can divide these kinds of things into knowledge, skills, and values. So we might want to think of it like that. So we've got the knowledge aspect. We have the actual framework of the 17 SDGs we could learn about. Within each of those, we can understand the facts and so forth. We've got the skills, professional skills, academic skills, but also importantly, political skills. So things like public speaking that we're talking about today, campaigning and so forth. And then you've got the whole set of values. How do you actually foster a commitment to sustainable development? And this is probably the most complex of all. Some people don't even think it's the place of the university to promote values. I think in the contemporary era, when we're looking at a massified, in some cases universalized system, a third of the global cohort going, the values element is important, but it's an extremely complex thing. I mean, you can't just sort of exhort people to adopt values and magically it happens. And I think, the most coherent way of doing that for an institution is just to embody the kinds of principles that you're actually espousing. So if an institution can actually show in its everyday workings that it's doing the kinds of things that are aligned with the SDGs in relation to the environment, energy usage and so forth, those aspects, but also the human relations side, if we're thinking about gender equality, actually embodying that in the everyday workings, then I think we've got a lot better chance of promoting those kinds of values. But at the end of the day, I think we do need to acknowledge and even embrace the fact that learning is unpredictable. And serendipitous, and you can't actually be sure what people are going to come out with. You know, some of these frameworks, the competency-based frameworks, assume that we can sort of predefine these things, and we're going to have these students coming out in a particular mold. And I think we need to recognize that we need to move to a different kind, you know, more of a process-based model where, you know, we create the right kind of environment, and that's about the classroom, but it's also about things outside the classroom that Tanya mentioned as well. It's about the experience, it's about being in cafes, it's about volunteering, about campaigning, and so forth. And I see it at the end of the day that the things we need are, you know, a space and a spark. I think you need a space to be able to reflect and deliberate, you know, and time to do those things. But you also need some kind of spark, some challenge or provocation, which might come from lecturers, it might come from the other students, or the ideas that are circulating that are going to allow people to make the deep transformation that's needed if we're going to move towards sustainable development.
Thanks. Yeah, I like that idea of the space and the spark. And I think the idea of serendipity and chance really feeds into what a lot of people are flagging as the role of university, which is to innovate. It's, as well as teaching, innovation and environment, you know, economic development and environmental growth need these kinds of innovation, you know, processes to happen. Phil, can I bring you in to respond to this question as well about, you know, what does it mean to be a teaching institution in the time of the SDGs?
Yeah, thank you, Martha. I think I like the sort of Humboldtian ideal of a university that did come out very clearly from the audience poll. This idea that teaching and research is done together, that students and academics are in a kind of shared journey in pursuit of truth. And that's where all that creativity and innovation that Tristan and Tanya spoke about. So I love that idealized model of universities as truth seekers. And I think that does make them, you know, society's critic and society's conscience. And I think if you accept universities in that role, it feels almost inevitable that the SDGs should permeate almost all teaching, especially if you also accept that more and more teaching has to be multidisciplinary, that we can't solve the world's big challenges, we can't create the sort of global citizens that we want without them having a really strong multidisciplinary view of the world. And I think if you accept all of those, it just feels like the SDGs would just be permeated throughout all of our teaching and learning. Critical thinking, truth seeking. So, you know, we're constantly looking at how we combat fake news, we combat climate denialism, we accept and challenge ideas that are being propagated by those of us who, or those people who are, you know, suggesting we might inject bleach to counter the coronavirus, for example. It should permeate everything. And I know the UN, the 75th anniversary, their economists put a report out just a few weeks ago, I think, that talk about the 5 global mega trends: it's climate change, inequalities, urbanization, population change, and technological revolution. And I just almost feel like they touch every single one of the 17 SDGs. And I think we almost can't avoid not having SDGs completely embedded across the whole curriculum. So not an add-on, not something that's a sort of optional extra, something that's fundamental to our education. So it's a bit of an idealistic view, but I think absolutely, I think that's the way we need to be heading as a global sector.
I would say the audience agrees with you. We're having a huge amount of questions coming in very specifically on the granularities of the curriculum, of university curriculums, and maybe even the school curricula as well. I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to respond to that. How can we actually, in practice, get the SDGs into that permeating role throughout the curriculum and throughout student life? Is there anyone who'd like to kind of take on that question?
I mean, I might jump in here, Martha. I mean, one thing we're thinking a lot about at Sydney, and when we think about the curriculum, we should also think about the kind of extracurricular environment within which the teaching sits. And I think turning your university into a kind of living lab within which students have a chance to kind of, in a sense, see, feel, touch, and contribute to what it means to be in a sustainable environment more generally all around them is a really powerful, I guess, motivator for how an education is perceived, and picking up on some of Tanya's points, you know, how you actually respond to the world you're living amongst. So curricula, all kinds of opportunities. We know that there'll be a kind of, you know, demand thing. Students will want and demand that their courses reflect the challenges of global sustainability. They'll want to know about their region. They'll want to know about the environment they're in. But I think the other thing that we need to be thinking about and doing, and it'll come up later, I'm sure, is, you know, universities need to turn themselves into sustainability living labs. You know, the way we think about our waste, the way we think about water, the way we think about how we operate every day on campus is critical. And there is a really deep, I think, educational aspect to it as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, universities are, they are places where thinking happens. They are Humboldtian places where we search for truth. And I love that idea of bringing that back to the kind of core of what we're talking about. But they're real places too. They're mini towns. They take up whole chunks of our cities and of our rural areas. And so they do have this opportunity, as you say, Duncan, to really to work through, like a town would, interlinked ecosystem problems. And I think they also have a responsibility and almost kind of reputational role to do so. If you don't, you know, you have to look at your own sustainability plans, your own kind of nuts and bolts sustainability, waste, recycling, you know, ways of doing things, as well as experimenting together with your students towards the new. Adriana, I'd love to bring you. Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say very quickly, and also to argue about it, right? I mean, there's a lot of disagreement. Yeah. I mean, it's not as though everything's hunky-dory and everyone agrees on what the consequences of a sustainable planet, world, city, town, university campus is. So I think we also have to learn how to engage in those deep disagreements and figure it out and disagree well in the process.
Absolutely. And I think once you get down beyond the SDGs, down to the different indicators of the SDGs, some of them end up bumping up against each other in terms of prioritization, in terms of taking you in different economic directions, which is a really interesting debate to have within a kind of ecosystem like university. Adriana, I'm going to bring you in now to kind of respond to this as well, if that's all right.
Sure. No, just reflecting on what has been said, I think that is also important when we're talking about the role of a university, to remind ourselves that universities are the product of the very societies that they are supposed or meant to change. And that poses quite difficult questions. So, of course, you know, we have great ambitions and goals and so on, but we work within a particular type of political economy that constrains the realization of those goals in many ways. And I think that we also have to be very honest about that. Now I'm thinking in, for instance, in the case of European universities, we still work very much within the framework of the Bologna Accord that makes, you know, universities respond very much to the marketplace in many ways. So again, it's not to play down at all the very important ethical and political role that universities can play, but just to remind ourselves as well about some of the boundaries of the political economy that we face. I noticed that there was a lot in terms of the, you know, what can we do through education? And I think that one of the most important things, going back to Tristan's point, in terms of, you know, just thinking and articulating knowledge, values, and skills, or I would speak more about capacities, even capacities to change the world. I think that one of the critical things is to really go deeper in more critical pedagogies. So it's difficult to think about, you know, students and teachers and teaching even and so on. I think that, you know, as we heard at the beginning, one of the most important things is to really make sense and support people and learners to make sense of both the codified and tacit knowledge, the knowledge of, you know, that you acquire and you work with in the classroom and outside the classroom. And I think that that takes us not only to innovation, to what new things we could do, but I think that to consider in that discussion and in relation to the SDGs, 4 different things. So one is a question of, you know, what to do and what innovation is required. But I think that we need to be very explicit about what not to do, a question that sometimes we don't have when we talk about innovation. Third, about the question of what we could do again. I mean, there are so many, you know, I know we face change in conditions, but there are so many important policies, ways about going change and so on in the past that somehow were disrupted that we might need to revisit. And of course, the question of what do we need to do differently. I stop here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a role for new making and for making new as well, to go back and see what's worked. And I think there's a comparative element, as Duncan was saying. If we're in a lab situation, we need to be comparing historically to now and across different campuses and different approaches, both in terms of teaching and in terms of other actions. Aromar, I'd love to bring you in here as well to have a comment on this.
Well, the thing is, just to pick up from where Adriana left off, see, the SDGs and universities themselves are not only about environmental and ecological sustainability. They're centrally about social questions and economic questions. So, questions of social justice, questions of class and economic justice are absolutely central. The world is currently in deep crisis. And, I was speaking to the General Assembly just 3 days ago, and what we were saying was that what we are seeing today with COVID is actually an SDG crisis. It started around health, but it's kind of permeated into pretty much everything, into poverty, into gender justice, into dealing with a whole range of crises. The only thing that might have improved in some places is, let's say, environmental conditions. So I think we really need to look at the university as embedded in social, political, and economic systems. And that's why the SDGs are so interesting. They relate to everyday life and the sort of operational crisis that we're dealing with, and knowledge as related to that. So if you're building knowledge around the way the world is actually working itself out, you couldn't be doing better than that. So curricula and actual action on the ground and knowledge is actually related very closely to that. So one mustn't forget that the SDGs are a bit of a mess because they're a political statement. I mean, we were involved in the negotiations. So we wanted to start with 10, so we could count them off on the fingers of each hand, and every child would know them. But the politics led them to becoming 17 and 169, this, that, the others. But that's the nature of life. And I think that's what universities have to sort of engage in, to try and reconstruct stuff to make sense in their own context.
Thanks so much. No, that's really interesting. I didn't know that they started as a kind of mnemonic on your hands, and then you have to now take off your shoes. So what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to move to Tanya in a minute. I'd like her to kind of reflect back. We offered it to her to start out this conversation. But I'm really also interested to hear from the audience. I wonder if we can set up a quick poll. What are their kind of key reflections coming back from this? What are the things that universities can do in a kind of, we started out in a kind of teaching and learning sense, but we've definitely flourished out since then. But what are the key things they think, or the top thing they think universities should do to take on the SDGs from a kind of teaching point of view, whether that's curricular, whether that's about experimentation as a living lab organization? That would be great to hear from the audience. And in the meantime, Tanya, do you want to come back in and talk us through where you're reflecting on from this discussion?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's been a really, really great discussion. I think the audience have raised a lot of really, really fantastic questions. As I'm sure you've seen, there's been so much about, we talk about integrating the SDGs into the curriculum. How do you actually do that? I think there's a great question that came up quite recently as well in terms of, some subject areas are more obviously sort of aligned with the SDG rather than others. How does it work when it comes to things like literature and history? So my sort of educational background is in no way at all related to the SDGs. I did English literature and French, and that's actually a question that I often ask myself. I sadly don't have the answer, but I do think that we need to be posing these questions. I think it's very easy to talk about, let's make the curriculum as interdisciplinary as possible, let's integrate the SDGs. But when it comes to subjects such as literature, I think currently the framework doesn't necessarily allow for that integration. So I think we need to be thinking a bit more broadly. Is there kind of a fundamental incompatibility between the way that we as students are asked to think about education now and the kind of quite narrow framework that maybe some courses, I think in particular, place us in, and then this kind of the breadth of interdisciplinary, thought that the SDGs actually invite. So yeah, I think currently, sadly, this integration isn't maybe as kind of possible in the practical sense as we'd like it to be. And I think that's where, again, as we've mentioned before, I think that's where extracurriculars come in. So for example, for me personally, that was, what kind of my engagement started, and that's been what's been inspiring me. And I think, again, as we discussed with the pandemic, I think it really makes us question again, how are we going to rethink extracurricular activities now when we don't have that physical space of a university campus? When we're talking about this living lab, how does that actually look in a world where we might all be scattered across the world? How do we foster these connections? How do we incentivize students to get involved in these extracurricular activities now? Because obviously it's going to be quite a lot harder, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my undergraduate was English literature as well. And I can see that when you come out of that kind of degree, that's very much driven by kind of, you do a lot of reading, then you kind of come out and you ask, how does this apply to everything around me? And I think it's a really interesting point of how do you bake that in, but also provide the kind of robust extracurricular activities that support students both to reflect back into their work and to think more widely. Tristan, I think I have a hand up from you as well. Do you want to come in and comment on this? And thank you all. Thanks for all the reflections coming in from the audience. Yeah, this is great. There's a lot about innovation, which is fabulous to hear, because that's where I work. There's a lot about working with governments, disseminating research. And yeah, I like the idea up here that someone's been saying we should really walk the walk. Absolutely. Tristan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it's a really important point that's been raised there by Tanya about different disciplinary areas in teaching. It's very important to address this issue. And I mean, it links in also with the research question, which we'll be talking about later. I mean, I just recently saw a paper that analysed funding for climate change research, and only 10% of that funding goes to social sciences, let alone arts and humanities. And of course, it's absolutely essential that we have the engineering, natural sciences, and so forth. But if we're thinking about teaching it, it absolutely needs to be embedded within those subjects, in addition to any kind of extracurricular activities, because we are talking about a humanity and models of living. And so it gets to the heart of absolutely everything that we think and do. Including in literary studies and history and so forth. So we're thinking about an actual shift of paradigm of the way human beings relate to each other and to the world. So it's essential that we think about that. And that links in with the epistemic question about pluralism and knowledge traditions, which I'm sure we'll come back to in this discussion as well, about decolonization and diversity of views, indigenous knowledge and so forth, which is also really important to address here, and to go beyond, medicinal plants and so forth, and to think actually about different ways of viewing the world, different ways of understanding how we acquire and share knowledge, and how we view ourselves as beings.
Yeah, we definitely have time put aside to speak about that. I mean, as Aromar said, this is a political decision-making process that got us to the SDGs, but they're global problems and they often manifest in global southern countries. So it'll be really interesting to talk through that epistemic question. And I think I had a hand up from Duncan as well, just to round off this section, although we don't have to round it off, we can just keep going. But Duncan, it's over to you.
Look, no, I was just in relation to Tanya's and Tristan's point about the humanities and social sciences and the SDGs. I mean, just an example. I mean, I think this is a role that universities have, especially comprehensive universities like UCL or my own. I mean, in the terrible bushfires in Australia in December and January, we had a workshop at the university. I think there was still kind of smoke in the air on the day of the workshop, but out of that came a really, I think, powerful recognition of the need for the humanities and social sciences and the engineering and science disciplines to engage in new ways. So one thing that came out, for example, was a project on taking the oral histories of communities on the East Coast that had been terribly burned out during the fires that occurred, and that's just generated a whole range of interesting opportunities. So, we have to work at it. You have to be purposeful, and again, I think that is something that universities have to get better at, and release some of the grip of disciplines on on our imagination and the way we operate as institutions.
Yeah, I think that makes a huge amount of sense, and I like the idea of that kind of breaking free of where it's very path dependent. We've built ourselves up to a certain way of thinking about how disciplines interact. You apply to a certain course and you take that course, but it doesn't need to be like that. We can rethink how that plays in. And I think it's kind of what you just brought up really feeds into the next university role that I want to spend some time exploring around universities as physical, geographical places that are set in a space that maybe invite international students, but are very much set within their community and their location. And I want to kind of start with you, Aromar, actually, and bring you in here, because I know that IIHS, as you mentioned, played a role in developing out SDG 11 with the aim for cities and human settlements to be inclusive, to be safe, to be resilient, and be sustainable. So I'm really interested to hear your reflections on this question of how do you be a university that acts on the SDGs from the point of view of being in place and space, being a place of human settlement as well?
So, I mean, we are a slightly different sort of to a traditional university. We was established to help shepherd one of the largest transitions that we'll see this century, which is basically the urbanization we'll see in South Asia. So, about 300 to 400 million new people coming into urban areas, 800 million people being in that space, a complete shift in culture from a rural sort of patriarchal, hierarchical culture into one that's urban with, potentially different imaginations. So it made sense for us because there's a connection between this and globalization to get deeply involved in the negotiations around the SDGs. And one of the challenges of the SDG frame, even as it exists at the moment, is that it's organized in the way that governments are organized. So it's organized by sector, but action, implementation, change happens in communities and around places. So the introduction of sort of all the spatialization or the localization of the SDGs was really the agenda that we worked on. And it was interesting. I mean, people don't necessarily know this, but the framing actually came from academics. And then it went into this complex engagement with countries and cities and processes like that. And it was a hop, skip, and jump pretty much across the world. I mean, remember the last thing that we did was there was a consultation in London, which we brought together people, including colleagues from UCL, and then in Sweden and then in India, to frame and outline how this can sort of work itself out. And interestingly, because the framing was the way it was, and we had taken into account some of the, let's say, the political economy of process, what you see today was what we, in a sense, sat and negotiated among themselves. So, like I said earlier, the questions of epistemic justice and its connection with social, ecological, or environmental and sort of economic justice are embedded into that frame. So it's the challenge, of course, beyond that is you've got a framework, it's politically agreed. How do you actually implement this? And how do you make that happen? And that is really the big tension we're facing at the moment. Because like you're saying in COVID, the implementation is happening with local and regional governments, but the power is sitting with national governments, fine? And national governments are not, they don't really like giving up either resources or people or money. So this is, in a sense, a deep political battle. And that's why, this question of the humanities and social sciences, absolutely central, because these changes we're talking about are changes that we expect to happen, let's say in the case of climate, in the next 15 or 20 years. Because if we don't make that change, we're going to be in deep trouble. The issue, of course, which is the issue of history and of literature, is how in the past or how in the present have these changes actually been made? This is something that, I'm trained as a technologist, I work on legal questions. These are things that those disciplines are unable to actually grapple with. So the question of grounding in space, the role of the university as a catalyst in space and in community is absolutely central. You can't, you're not a sort of island or whatever it is, it's a temple on top of the hill. You're in the middle of the real world today, and if you don't make the change, it will change you.
Absolutely, and I would advise the audience to go and check out Aromar's video after this as well, where he explains some of the role that the IIHS has played a bit more widely. And so two other people who really engaged with these concepts that are being brought up around shift, around transition, around power shifts, I think, in their videos are Tristan and Adriana as well. And I'd love to throw it out to you, this question of what is the role of universities in implementing the SDGs at this kind of place, space? And it's difficult because you have, it's multi-layer. You start at local, place and space, but you always end up spinning out into global interactions, global trends. So I'd love you to reflect on that. And maybe Adriana, I'll bring you in first to think about that.
Sure, Martha, thanks. Just building upon what Aro was saying, I think that perhaps a first big role has to do with pushing and rethinking the boundaries of the SDGs themselves. And I think about, I'm playing obviously with the title for this conference, but I think that that's crucial. And I see the thinking or pushing the boundaries at least in three different ways. One, highlighted by Aro, has obviously to do with the sort of somehow sectorial organization of the world that is somehow, transparent in the 17 SDGs. And of course, we know that there are synergies, but there are also trade-off across the SDGs and sometimes even within the SDGs. So we do need to work across that, because we could be otherwise even implementing the separate SDGs with very schizophrenic outcomes. So that's quite important. A second important thing has to do with the aspirations themselves as well that are embodied in the SDGs. And I think that in some cases we find a push, say, for instance, with regards to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, environmental questions, climate change, and so on, is much more embedded across all the SDGs, but still there are important silences. And I think that one is definitely the silence on justice. Again, the language of justice is not explicitly used, although all the SDGs are about affecting some form, different forms of environmental and social justice. But But we also find in some cases some very important omissions. I'm thinking, for instance, if you look at SDG 8, the focus is on economic growth, promotion of economic growth, and then you will see an effort to also talk to, you know, the informal sector, the employment for the youth, gender equality, and so on, but no mention at all of this solidarity economy. And this is very important. So it's not only about growing and so on. So there is, in some cases, aspirations that are problematic. And I think that we need to push for those. The third level, the third type of boundary that I think that we need to be very mindful has to do with the geography of the SDGs. If we think about them, the bulk, not only, but the bulk of the positive impacts and outcomes that we are trying to pursue through the SDGs has quite a lot of relevance and has to speak to the reality of the so-called Global South. And yet, you know, how we engage with the Global South, you know, in not just in the implementation, in the, you know, of a solution, but in the whole definition, you know, of a minimal process of implementation is crucial. In that sense, again, when we go back to the role of what universities can do, I think that a first important activity has to do with aligning much more the tangible and intangible impacts of what we do. So it is about the content, but it's very much about what we practice. And I think in here, for instance, we are used to see universities adopting sustainability campus plans and so on, which is very good news. But I think that we need to go beyond the idea that, you know, having an impact on the place, you know, on the environment and so on, can be just restricted to, for instance, divest from fossil fuels or make our buildings like UCL has, you know, zero carbon, zero plastic and so on. There is far more to that. And I think that we do need to engage in parallel. For instance, I think one important element has to do with also anticipating the unintended consequences of universities' investments. I mean, universities' investments have a huge responsibility, for instance, in generating processes of displacement, gentrification, and so on. And we cannot react like we didn't know that. We know that that happens. So we need to anticipate those. A second point in relation to what to do or what to do differently for me has to do with going beyond the call for multi or interdisciplinarity. I think that that's a minimum we should aspire for, but I think that we have to work in a transdisciplinary way. And that takes us back to this very important relationship between, you know, how do we work, you know, with others on matters, you know, say from a Northern university, in matters that have global impacts, in matters that are embedded in completely different elsewheres and across very different geographies. So I think that the issue of transdisciplinarity is crucial, and that in simple terms, it means, you know, obviously, how do we ask the questions that guide our research? It's not only about the co-production, you know, when we come to the field and so on. It's very much about the very formulation of those questions and their implementation. So I think that, you know, to conclude, I think that in a way, we do have to keep on pushing from this idea of being a university to practice a much more pluriverse way of doing research, doing teaching, and so on. And that has to acknowledge, you know, that universities don't hold, you know, the truth, are not the only producers of knowledge. They are one among many others. There are many other knowledges that need to be acknowledged, valued, and so on. And we need to talk to them in a much more agile way than we actually do right now.
Adriana, I love that, but it throws up so many questions. Like, I've just thrown up 3 different areas of questions coming from what you're talking about. In a minute, I'm going to ask Phil to come in, but firstly, I'd just like all of the panel, I'm going to ask a subsequent question to just think about. So Adriana pointed out the kind of investments, the high consumption activities that are undertaken by universities. Can universities, as relatively high consumption activities, you know, we're not making steel, but we do consume, and we do consume space as well as energy. Can the activity be sustainable, and do the benefits of universities that detract perhaps from some of these sustainability goals? And actually, I've circulated this within the environment or the energy space, but more broadly, do the elements of universities that detract from the SDGs get weighed out by those that support the SDGs currently? So that's my question for a minute, but in a minute, I'm firstly just going to bring in Phil to respond because he's had his hand up.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to go back to that point about universities as, you know, deeply embedded parts of their communities, in their situations. I think we'll talk a little bit later about the role of metrics and the role of rankings and the sort of consumer power that can be asserted there. But just to mention actually the Times Higher Education impact rankings, which are framed entirely around the 17 SDGs, 17 individual rankings. We have a theory of change where we of course look at university teaching, of course we look at university research, their contribution to new knowledge, but we also look at outreach, how far they're working with NGOs and charities and governments around the world. But the key bit, the final bit, which I think is really game changing in terms of the comment that was made on Slido about walking the walk, is that we evaluate universities on their stewardship of their own resources and their own assets. So of course, when it comes to climate change, we will look at whether they have, environmentally friendly policies on campus, whether they're, consuming energy in a responsible way, what they're doing to offset their carbon footprints, etc. But the thing that I think is really powerful is that we judge them across all of the SDGs. So when we're looking at decent work in economic growth, for example, I think it's SDG 8, we're asking them about how their own employment practices. Do they pay the minimum wage? Do they have proper union recognition in place? How much casualization do they have? When it comes to equalities, we're looking at the student intake. Are they actually diversifying their intake? Are they widening access and encouraging social mobility? Gender, we challenge them on the proportion of senior female leaders, for example, and on ethnic diversity as well. So I'm really like the fact that we're collecting data for the first time that holds the institutions account for their own stewardship of their own affairs and their own responsibilities. So I think that sits very much within the broader framework of as one of the comments said earlier, walking the walk, putting their money where their mouth is, as well as contributing to the new knowledge that will be fundamental to finding solutions and ensuring that we can address the SDGs.
Thanks. And that also with the concept of metrics and rankings does speak back to the question I was posing a little bit, the idea that, universities take up a lot of they consume highly in terms of resources. They have histories which are not so necessarily meritocratic as they are just educating the same people that they've educated for hundreds of years and not contributing to social mobility potentially, or maybe that's the landscape here in the UK to some degree. So can I pose this wider question for the whole panel? How can we think of universities as kind of net positive or on the SDGs? Like, are there things that we need to, activities that detract from the SDGs that we need to get kind of weighted out by those which are positive, moving towards kind of sustainability over the long term? Throwing that out to the floor. Aroma, I think you might want to respond on that.
So quickly, I mean, it's fairly simple in one way. Universities are places where we teach, we research, we practice, we live and work. So if we don't actually put all of this stuff into practice there, how can we teach or inspire? It's very simple in some ways. So if you come and see what we try and do here in India, of course, it's very contextual. We have the largest population of poor people in the country. We have large numbers of people who are sort of underemployed or unemployed. So we have to integrate that context into what we're doing this now. So when we track what Phil was saying, we track how much employment we can generate, in the first order and the second order. It's very important for us because otherwise we're not doing very much. So I guess the integration of real life and these transformations into the business practice, into the teaching and the research is kind of central to what we're doing. So whether it's net positive carbon, which we're doing, reduction of footprints, reduction of water consumption, which is very critical. You have to walk the talk. Otherwise, young people today are not going to be willing to listen to you because they can see the world. This is a world of the climate emergency and of a whole range of other things. And they might be, I think they're very much in a place where they're able to take stuff in their own hands and say, look, if you don't teach us about this, we'll teach ourselves. It's almost, I would say, a 68 moment at the current point of time.
Tanya, I'd love to hear your views on this. Are we at a 68 moment for students finding out about, young people are kind of more concerned about the climate crisis than the older generations, and then they have been before, which is, forms part of the SDGs. Are we at a 68 moment, would you say?
Perhaps. I mean, I do think that, there definitely are examples of that happening. And I think it's fantastic sometimes to have the younger generation, take the reins into their own hands. I think, again, that's a fantastic example of you know, the fact that they have learned leadership, they have learned these skills, that they are actually able to drive their own learning outside of the classroom, or perhaps put pressure onto, I don't know, academics, anyone older generation. But at the same time, I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of a positive thing. And I think that, you know, we keep going back to this idea that we need to change these larger frameworks. We need to start, obviously, bottom up is fantastic, but we do also need to do top to bottom, and kind of work on integrating the SDGs at all levels, ranging from students to academics, staff, but also the managerial team at the very, very top.
I think that's hugely important. And one thing I think that often gets overlooked in discussions about universities is the role of non-academic staff, and the role of professional services, the role of people who maintain and look after the buildings, especially now that we're not necessarily in the buildings. They still need all that work to be done. So I think it's really important that actually we think top to bottom, but as wide as possible. I think there'll be a great deal of demand. Yes. One of my AV team is saying, yes, AV staff as well, absolutely. I want to throw it over to Duncan, I think, who wants to come in on this one.
The only thing I was going to add, I mean, I think Tanya and Phil and Aro have all touched on this, but I think there is a fundamental point about universities just becoming more open as institutions, becoming more porous as institutions. And that's an easy thing to say, but I think it is quite a deep challenge for institutions that historically, culturally, politically, economically, and for not, you know, for good reasons, have seen themselves as slightly apart from society, as I guess inferring from that apartness, from the need to be critical, to be sort of set yourself apart. And I think that is something which is just becoming clearer and clearer to me every day in the role I've got here at Sydney, becoming more open and porous to our immediate neighborhood, becoming more open and porous to the desires and aspirations of our students, both on campus and when they, you know, go off and do things in the world, more porous and open to the cities we're in and the regions we're in and the worlds we're in. I still think that's something that universities struggle with, and that's a challenge, I think, for the next 10 to 15 years, and also I think an enormous source of opportunity. Probably the most exciting things I've been involved in the last 3 or 4 years have usually involved some new partnership, some new connection that both brings things onto campus and takes things that we do out into the world in a new way. And I think, as Zara was saying, the SDGs are going to require that kind of civic porousness between universities, governments, firms, NGOs, activists, you name it.
Absolutely, it's an opening up that allows for critique, allows for building. It's becoming part of this wider community. And again, Duncan's video that he produced for this really speaks well to that. So please do go and watch that afterwards for more of his thoughts there. Tristan, do you want to come in and comment on this as well?
Just a coda on these discussions that links with this idea of porosity to communities and how universities contribute, but also the question of campus sustainability and so forth. And I think just to remember that universities around the world many are working in extremely difficult conditions and economic conditions. And a lot of this is linking back to the political economy point that Adriana made earlier. It's a very unfavorable moment for many universities to do these kinds of things, particularly if you're thinking about the huge rise of private sector and particularly for-profit universities that have obvious, economic rationales and constraints. And even public universities with a huge drop in public funding. It doesn't make this kind of work impossible, but it does make it extremely challenging. And I think it's important to remember those different kinds of conditions that a large proportion of the thousands of higher education institutions in the world have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll come on to talk about the kind of marketplace for education and how that's affecting our ability to do stuff in a little bit, but I'm really keen actually to address, I've been looking at Marina's question that's come to the top of the Slido list, and I really want to pose it both to the audience and to us internally at the same time. So if we can turn that one into a poll team, that'd be great. But for the panelists, how can higher education, with the help of the SDGs, contribute to the decrease of political and economic inequalities, both globally and locally? And this is something that again came up in some of your forethoughts that you shared with us. So I'm super interested to hear what you have to say. Anyone want to come in first?
Shall I jump in, Martha?
Yeah, please do.
So I think, one of the core challenges is, if you look at the history of the recent universities were in a sense designed to create and propagate elites, right? But in today's world, where in countries like, let's say, in Asia, 30% or 40% of the population, which are in the billions, are actually coming through university systems. That idea of elites is kind of, it's been completely sort of dismantled, along with what we're seeing just now in terms of remote teaching and digital learning and stuff like that. So I guess one of the core challenges is, how can you maintain, the search for truth, the Humboldtian kind of frame, along with the question of inclusion at the same time? And how can you make that structural? And in some ways, I guess the tension of the market is the market, especially when it becomes large, huge student debt, etc., is a mechanism that excludes rather than includes. So I think this is a core challenge we're facing across the world. How can you manage with scale? That's very important, because that's what people want. That's what a knowledge economy is sort of based on. But how can you maintain quality, excellence, depth, and engagement with knowledge, along with inclusion, and inclusion along its multiple dimensions? UCL is a classic example of that sort of revolution in the 19th century, which allowed a whole range of communities that were not able to come into the historical UK universities to come in. But today there are many other issues that are there, whether it's gender, it's LGBTQ, et cetera, which need to be brought in. So this is a deep structural question, and I'm not sure that we have, particularly good examples across the world, but maybe, we can try and pull some of that conversation together. Yeah,
I think UCL is very proud of its history of bringing in people that didn't profess a religion to come and be part of the university when it wasn't possible. But I think, that's the bare minimum. There's a long way to go. And I think that it's not just in our student body, in everyone's student body, it's in how can we actually use the SDGs and our work through them to further equality. Is there anyone else who wants to come in on that question, Adriana or Phil? Phil, go for it.
Just a really quick comment, really, which is just the fundamental basics of that. We won't tackle the challenges, the existential challenges threatening the world, unless we collaborate across borders. And absolutely, that does mean much greater collaboration from the global north to the global south, and much more equal collaboration from the global north to the global south. And there's a possible bit of light here in terms of the current crisis. It's exposed extraordinary inequalities, but what it might be able to do is open up more university collaborations from the global north to the global south, particularly in overcoming extraordinarily hostile visa, environment, and immigration regimes and cost prohibitations to accessing knowledge and accessing events. I was involved in a conference at the University of Cape Town, and there was a huge excitement in Africa that suddenly the rather closed world of academic events, particular disciplinary-led conferences, were massively opened up by a move to digital, by the grounding of flights that actually helped make research and collaboration and sharing more accessible. So just a sort of a fundamental element that we should all accept, that we don't get this without absolutely equal collaboration, global north, global south, and that we might have an opportunity here to properly smash down some of the barriers and transcend some of the sort of geopolitical barriers that are being erected in some countries that prevent sharing, that whip up nationalism, that have a sort of protectionist element even to knowledge. Knowledge has to absolutely transcend nationalist protectionism. And I do think this is a great opportunity and a huge example of global sharing actually doing something rather special in hopefully producing the vaccines that we need and the set tests and traces and treatment systems that we're going to use to get out of this particular pandemic.
So it's a shade of optimism there, I think. And I'm wondering actually though how that interacts with a lot of the underpinning structural day-to-day seeking for funding that happens at the heart of academia. And I'm wondering if there's any comments that the panel might make on how do we get not just to a verbal collaboration between different partners of different parts of the world, but an actual structure underpinning that incentivizes that. So there is significant funding, equal funding available to these different types of collaboration that are long-term, not just one-off. Adriana, I wonder, you don't have to answer that question, but you do have your hand up. So if you want to come in, please do.
Sure, Martha, thank you. I was just thinking about what Phil was reflecting about, and also a very interesting question that came on the line about the opportunities brought by COVID to sort of like, shape the sort of, the muscle we have to really deal with the changes required. And I was thinking with regards to that, perhaps two things. On the one hand, it is undoubtedly that the COVID-19 crisis has brought, perhaps as an opportunity at great cost, of course, a wide realization, societal realization of inequality. And so we know, how much have we heard now, even on the streets saying, okay, this is not just because of COVID. Only COVID magnified, brought to the fore inequalities and inequality drivers that pre-existed that crisis. And I think that the fact that we are having that much wider conversation that is not just about a health crisis, but a housing crisis, a water and sanitation crisis, a gender equality crisis, and so on, is very important. So I think that we do need to use and keep this momentum of an expanded conversation. I think that the second very important thing is that we have witnessed in very few months also very bold measures that made the world look completely different. The imagination of how change could look like is very different today. And I'm thinking, for instance, about things like, we have spent decades talking about the need to stop homelessness or forced evictions. And sadly, in a few months, we saw governments across the world taking measures, to at least discontinue forced evictions and discontinue homelessness and so on. And we saw that, through the redeployment of existing housing stocks, mortgage and rental holidays, a whole set of batteries that were unimaginable, back at the end of 2019. So I think that one of the tricks is to really go deeper into that and say, how can we sustain those measures that are really tackling very central questions present in the SDGs beyond the pandemic? And I think that that's a real crucial point. Just one addition, we haven't talked about the pace of change required. And I think that we have to acknowledge that the pandemic has also changed things dramatically. The UN is saying that we now face between 2 and 3 decades, lost decades. I come from Latin America. I know very well what just even 1 decade, lost decade, means, in the development, in the intergenerational development, of the whole region. So let alone 2 to 3 decades. So that means that even the SDGs and many of the targets are out of place. We need to revise them in terms of, because we are behind where we were when the SDGs were designed, and agreed. So that's a very important, the pace of change is very important. And of course, the fact also the risk that we follow the risk that in many contexts, the prospect of a very long recession ahead of us might also trigger very re-entrenched behavior in terms of saying, okay, but before we are global, before we act globally and so on, we have to guarantee, the financial viability of our institutions, be that a university or other type of organization. So we have to also be very watchful what that sense of a crisis and a recession and a crisis after the health crisis also does to us and the way in which we work.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting about the pace of change. Agenda 2030 is to 2030. We have 8 years left now. No, not just over. It could have been really interesting to open up this whole debate and say, should we be adding to the SDGs? And I know that Aromar was deeply involved in the negotiation and development of the SDGs, and I'm sure that he would explain to us how pie in the sky that would be to change them, how difficult they were to get together. But it's a really interesting thing, you have a pandemic and it upends everything that the ways that economies are working, the way that societies are working. Should we be changing structurally the goals that we now have? I work with a lot of local governments who are thinking about, should they be moving, should they reset their strategic goals? Should they reset their economic missions in line with the pandemic, either for recovery, for Build Back Better, for Build Back Beyond? All these kinds of phrases are coming up. It's a really interesting question of actually within the time we have left, should we be wholly upending or wholly adding Christmas tree ornaments to the SDGs? I'm going to ask Tristan to come in on that question or to kind of add to Adriana's points, because similarly in his video, he made some really interesting points that speak well to them, I think.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think in the university we need to we do need to think a lot more radically and with a lot more imagination. The Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos has this idea of the pluriversity and the subversity. So we need to be working at two different levels. We need to think about transforming mainstream universities, but also allowing space for these kind of subversive institutions at the peripheries to come onto scene. And I think there are some fantastic examples of small-scale institutions that are doing different things that are really fascinating, looking at the intercultural universities in Mexico, for example, and that's some of them are state supported, and then you've got small scale like private liberal arts colleges like Ashesi in Ghana, which is also doing a extraordinary work as an institution for ethical leadership. So we have got some really interesting examples, but I think we need to allow a lot more space for this. I still think the environment's very difficult for these kinds of institutions to emerge and be viable. And we need to provide that space. I'm particularly thinking that I think we actually have a lot less diversity in higher education than we think we do. I mean, if you look at the European university comes onto the scene, 12th century or so. Before that, you've got some very strong higher education traditions around the world, in India, in the Islamic world, Mesoamerica, China, and so forth. And most of those traditions, they recede, and we don't have a homogeneous global university, of course, but there is a lot of uniformity in terms of the deep structures of the institution. And I think it's that we need to question to a much greater extent. The roads must fall, decolonization debates have been very helpful in that. South African movement's very strong. There's a much older tradition in Latin America, very strong tradition of that along the decolonial lines, and that's part of the helping us to question and to critique and recreate as well.
Yeah, this is a hugely important discussion point that touches all the SDGs and is, I think, something that we will should be talking about as front of mind within the university sector now and for the next, years to come. Is there anyone else who wants to come in on that point that Tristan's just made and kind of round off this session a little bit? We've got 25 more minutes, and I'm really keen to get to this understanding that some of the questions that have been raised by the audience, and also thinking about this, universities as part of a global marketplace of commercial activity as well as what we've talked through.
Can I come in for a second there, Martha?
Yeah, please do.
So I guess the thing is, we are at sort of the edge of the Anthropocene. There are 8 billion of us. We have almost a $100 trillion economy. And we have remarkable technology, including 5G that's going across the world, right? So we have no lack of resources. The challenge is that the kind of changes that we need to make have to be made in a generation or so. And those are very hard challenges. You can't give up on ending poverty. You can't give up on food security. You can't give up on health, as we're saying with COVID. And these are very large problems. So we need places which can engage with these questions in context, and also, in this sort of larger global frame. And in effect, we have to rebuild the global university system to enable us to do that. Because if you don't have safe spaces to innovate and to fail, because innovation is also about trying odd things and failing and then building new things, then we're in deep trouble, both nationally and I would say almost as a species, because the rate of change that we require, we have no precedence of in the past. I mean, at this scale. And COVID is speaking to us about that every day, that we have to go back and question the frameworks of business as usual, etc. And whether it's going back to sort of pre-colonial ways of thinking or sort of 21st century ways of engagement of how knowledge creation is taking place. I think I would agree with Tristan about the fact that we need a range of plural experiments across the world, which of course involve some of the existing universities, but lots of new things need to happen.
Thanks so much. I'm going to come back kind of as a devil's advocate to this idea of business as usual, because I think business is where I want to take the conversation now for the last little bit, to think about, universities are currently, and we can challenge this if we like, part of a wider global institution, global kind of ecosystem, which has commercial drives, they are competitive, they have rankings, they have all these different elements at play, and they are trying to attract different forms of people to come and interact with them in different ways. I'm really interested to understand what is the interplay here with the SDGs. But firstly, just to say a huge thank you to the audience for all the poll answers that you sent in. We're saving them, and they're really helpful for us to kind of learn from and reflect on what we think we're saying, what you think we think we're saying, and what your opinions are. So thank you so much for your huge levels of engagement. So I'm going to start here with Phil, if that's all right. So Phil, how can a university set a strategy that is both SDG oriented, that draws on all of this rich wealth of conversation and ways of being, taking into account an international space and a local place, but that's also kind of commercially minded? Do these sit at odds with each other? Do we need to change how universities prioritize what they're looking for? Big question. So Phil, I don't know if you're ready to start.
I'll give it a go. It's a very big question. Yeah, I mean, look, Times Higher Education has been around for 50 years, providing insights and data. And obviously for 17, 18 years, we've produced the World University Rankings, which is very much based on a kind of Anglo-Saxon idealized vision of excellence, which is a sort of, as I said earlier, Humboldtian vision perfected in America with Johns Hopkins, but the likes of UCL, Sydney, Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge are leading those sorts of traditional rankings based on research excellence. We really do the data less actually as a consumer tool for students, but actually more as a strategic tool for university leaders to understand the shifting sands of the knowledge economy, to understand their strategies against international competitors. And it actually was driven originally back in 2003 by a UK government report on governments needing a mechanism to actually understand return on investment for research funding. But actually just a couple of years ago, we thought it was absolutely essential that we break the mold a little bit and understand that there was many more versions of excellence out there. You know, some of the greatest universities in the world in the traditional sense are doing a pretty bad job in terms of sustainable development, you know, particularly in terms of their own affairs. As I mentioned earlier, some institutions have an appalling record on social inclusion. Certainly, they're not necessarily doing anywhere near enough on employment practices and equalities in the workforce, et cetera, well documented. So we wanted to reframe a ranking that touched on the social and economic impact of universities. So we created the impact rankings, and we just thought there was no better mechanism. We did actually consider for a while, how do you define impact? It's easy to measure around economic impact, you know, economic growth, intellectual property, licenses, patents, all the great economic outcomes of university ideas. But I was really pleased, actually, my colleague Duncan Ross thought we could frame it much more broadly around the SDGs. And I guess just to cut a long story short, I think we were looking at the SDGs as a way of supporting universities in their own strategic decision-making to help them benchmark and understand. And on one level, it's been incredibly effective. We've seen institutions bringing an incredibly diverse array of data and information into the center of the institution, having a central visibility of all the diverse activity they're doing that contributes to the SDGs. And as I said, it's through teaching and through research, but also through their outreach and collaborations with NGOs and governments, but also through their own stewardship. So on one level, it's really powerful that we've brought it into the senior leadership of universities as a coherent vision of a massively diverse array of activity. But I think the other area where it's perhaps got huge potential is that it demonstrates good practice. It highlights good practice that's perhaps been invisible before, and it rewards good practice because the rankings have this extraordinary power to grab attention, to capture the public imagination. And what we are starting to see, and I hope we can see it more so in the future, is that this does become a little bit of a carrot and stick approach. The universities can harness the data, they can identify potential partners, they can highlight good practice, they can demonstrate their impact to their stakeholders and government, etc. But more and more, we do actually also expect students will start asking questions. You know, as Duncan mentioned earlier, universities becoming much more open about what they do, what they don't do, how they contribute. And I actually would like to see this in that, you know, there's no question that universities are a fantastic public good. Many of them are absolutely public focused, but they do live in a competitive space for talent. There is a market in the UK, in Australia, in America in particular for talent, for student recruitment. And I do think the rankings that we do on impact could become a very powerful tool in holding universities to account and providing a stick as well as a carrot, in the sense that they can actually expose those universities who aren't doing so well or who don't want to open themselves up to that level of scrutiny. So I'd say that was a slightly rambling answer to a very open question, but I hope that sort of sets where we're trying to come from a rankings perspective here. It's not just a consumer tool. It's hopefully something that universities can harness to improve and to share knowledge and share good practice as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think talking of students asking questions, I think we'll have it'd be really interesting to have Tanya's response to that, whether it is just universities who look at these or whether it's students as well.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much, Martha, and thank you so much, Phil. And yeah, that's actually exactly what I wanted to say, to sort of, I guess, play devil's advocate to an extent. Obviously, Phil, I think it's, it's quite interesting that you started your point by saying, look, these aren't actually just for consumers to look at. These aren't just the students to look at. What we really want is to have these university leaders be scrutinized, hopefully help them develop their practice and whatnot. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. But at the same time, I think we cannot deny the importance of these various rankings when it comes to students. As you said yourself, Phil, they are attention grabbing. For example, for me, I didn't grow up in the UK, and I'm sure that a lot of international students can relate. For a lot of parents, that is exactly what grabs their attention. That is the basis on which they judge a lot of universities. So I think that, I think there was a question that came up earlier as well about, is there kind of this certain tension between the values that these rankings are promoting, what they're reflecting, and then, kind of some of the other opinions that academics have offered in this discussion. But yeah, I think we can't sort of deny that the rankings are there. The rankings are very, very, very important. And I think what you've said in terms of how they've evolved over the years is fantastic. I think it's, we can't just kind of say, look, the rankings are in some ways maybe outdated. They can evolve, they are evolving. And I think that it's also really important to consider, are they reflecting students changing expectations when they come to university? Or what is it that students want to see from these rankings? What is it that students themselves want to kind of have the universities evaluated on? And to what extent, would it actually, for example, impact their university choice when it's the impact ranking? So I think that's something that would be quite interesting to ask incoming students, perhaps.
I'd love to just jump back in there again, Tanya. Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things we're trying to do is genuinely offer students a much richer view of what excellence looks like. Of course, there'll be parents and families who have got their heart set on their students going to UCL or to Oxford or Cambridge or one of the great institutions of the world. But actually trying to open up a whole wide range of other data points. It's not just, where the Nobel Prizes are coming from and what are the most renowned institutions in the world. It's which ones are actually making a contribution to society. And I think what's wonderful about this is it really does smash open the idea of prestige. You've got the likes of Sydney and Duncan's University doing exceptionally well in the impact rankings and in the traditional research excellence rankings, but we're seeing so many new and different universities performing well against particular SDGs. India, for example, struggles to get any universities into the top couple of hundred in the traditional world rankings, but they have a lot of the IITs, a lot of institutions doing incredibly well in very specific SDG areas. So I hope what we're doing is just giving students a much broader range of data points to ask their own questions, to hold their universities to account, and to make informed decisions. And I think that will come down to it when there's a choice of institutions, knowing that one of them has a set of open metrics that says they are doing this on equality, they are doing what they can do on being sustainable in their campus. It will really help the decision making. And I hope incentivize good behavior and incentivize the universities to raise their game to demonstrate this, because as you said earlier, students are increasingly, I'm not sure if it's quite the 1968 moment, but students are asking much more demanding questions and making far greater expectations around the whole SDG agenda.
I'm really interested as well to bring Duncan in on this as someone who spoke in his video about, how does one set up a university strategy when you're an ambitious university or an ambitious department, you've got kind of somewhere to go and you're trying to be SDG oriented. How do you go about setting that strategy that takes into account all of these pieces? And as Phil said, University of Sydney has done very well on THE rankings. What does that make you then think and do? What's the next step from that strategically? Okay.
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I don't think I have too much more to add than Phil and Tanya. But I think I even tweeted this on the day. I think God knows we need another ranking. But if we are going to have another one, this is probably not a bad one to have. And I think I think Phil and his team deserve some credit for actually thinking hard about what is it that we want to measure, and what contribution can we make. Given the kind of rankingization of higher education, which I think to speak frankly, has had some downsides to it. But I think universities any university that doesn't grapple with these issues is going in some ways to fail its students, fail its alumni, fail its community, and to a certain extent, fail the world. I mean, we also have to understand, what our strengths and what our contribution can be, to pick up a point that Albert has on the Slido. So, I guess the way we see it is, given how important these issues are to our students, our staff, our community, our future students, we don't want rankings to drive our strategy, but they do provide you with one lens on what other people think about what you're doing. And I think that's always important to take on board and to take seriously, and not to be driven by it as an end in itself, but as a sort of contribution or a perspective on what you're doing. Whether there should be rankings. I mean, at a conference a little while ago, Phil and I had a discussion about this where, my sense was, why not have sort of, universities are sort of given a kind of almost an accreditation, right? You're in the gold or silver or bronze, whatever. I mean, there's different ways of doing it. But I think what's really important is it helps you focus on what matters, and it provides a perspective on the extent to which you are walking the walk, the extent to which you're orienting your institution towards these issues. It doesn't solve them. It doesn't mean you're succeeding in everything you do, but it just gives you that additional perspective. I think we need, it's part of that earlier point I made, I think we need to be open and hold ourselves accountable for the rather grand statements that vice chancellors and deputy vice chancellors make. You gotta walk the walk. You gotta be accountable for it. And this is one, not the only one, but it's one way we can do it.
Thanks so much, and thank you for bringing up Albert's question, which I've been wanting to address throughout the session because it's been so well upvoted. Don't universities have a tremendous credibility problem? While barely able to govern themselves, which we can address that in probably a whole other webinar, and implement strategy again. They want to address global challenges. So let's focus on the credibility piece here, because it's actually come up a few times from questions being raised by the audience. Are universities credible in reflecting back the values of the world into their activities and to getting us to the SDGs? Do we have a credibility? We also don't have long, we've got 8 minutes. So I'd love to throw that out. Bill, do you want to have a go at that question? And then anyone else, let me know if you want to respond.
Thanks, Martha. Yeah, I'll be as quick as possible because I know I've been speaking quite a lot. First of all, I don't really accept Albert's suggestion that they can't govern themselves. I was a news reporter for about a decade on Times Higher, and one of my specializations was muckraking and investigative journalism. And I honestly believe sincerely that the UK university sector, the global university sector, is phenomenally clean in terms of actually pretty good governance. They've got slow and challenging structures and systems, but actually I don't think they need to be fundamentally rebuilt. Credibility wise, I think there is a massive issue around a popular.
I think we've got a stuck Phil. Aromar, you had your hand up as well. We'll get back to Phil as soon as he comes back in. But Aromar, do you want to take a stab at this question?
Well, I mean, I would partially agree with Phil about the fact that universities are learning how to govern themselves much better, and I think part of the conflict is that universities are really not firms. I mean, we can learn from the firm in terms of how to manage things better. But our role in society is not to replicate the firm or to replicate government. It's to perform a very different role. And I think the quicker we are able to sort of focus on that for all these constituencies, the better it is. But having said that, I think, Phil's gone off, but I think THE's done both themselves and the rest of the world a great favor by putting the SDGs on their ranking. Because in some senses, to be provocative, it's a good thing to be able to rank the universities on the SDGs. What I would really like them to put out is something that we do from SDSN, where we rank countries and we rank cities. So the real question is, over a 10-year or 20-year period, are you not only improving your own ranking and sort of meeting the goals as far as the SDGs are concerned, is your work making your city, your community, and your country different? Whether it's on inequality or gender justice. I mean, that is in a sense the real attribution, fine? You can do your stuff for your own institution, but have you really been able to change the course of history in the places where you live in and work in and research in and the countries you work in. Of course, global universities could duck out and say, look, we've got greater global impact. But the fact is, you do need to have local impact, and that's where the changes actually happen.
Yeah, it's worth flagging what Aram has just mentioned, the UN SDS and the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which he runs in and his institute runs in India, and which we're looking to scope out running here at UCL as well with my institute IIPP. It's a really interesting kind of ranking and metrics. It's a big network of global universities who are working exactly on this question and problem. So it's, we almost should have come to it much earlier in the discussion, but actually it's a really huge source of resources. We've only got 5 minutes left. This has actually gone way faster than I thought, and I think we've got loads still left on the table to discuss. I think there's a poll going out to the audience with a couple of questions, both about learnings and reflections, and also what was missing from this discussion. What should we put in next time that wasn't here? But I'm going to quickly do a 30-second roundup with all of our panelists. If you could just give me, you could leave the audience who will be attending the next 10 sessions of this conference with one thought to take with them. What would that be? And I'll come to Adriana first, if that's all right.
Okay, yeah, no pressure. I don't think that I'm going to tell people what their thought could be, but at least I just want to share one thought that I take away from this message, this discussion, among many others. But I think that the last discussion, the last part of the discussion has been very interesting. And in terms of, again, rethinking performance, rethinking, rankings, hierarchies, and so on, I think that that's really powerful. But one thing I was thinking all the way through is we do not have an SDG that tries to tackle epistemic injustice. So I think that the ranking should also include that. And it might sound very abstract, but it doesn't have to be. We can, for instance, look at, to what extent and what's the level of co-authorship, international co-authorship with, with partners and so on that we work with, that we take and so on. The figures exist and they're shocking for UK and British universities. So they can be very simple indicators that also render and hold us accountable in terms of, again, the impacts that we have on epistemic injustice and justice. And this is not just a question of access to education. It goes far more than that. So I just leave it with that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adriana. I think we have Phil back on the line. So Phil, if you want to do your 30-second reflection, that would be super. Thanks.
Thanks for your patience. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, I'm coming at this from a very specific point of view, and that is as a data organization. But I just think the power of data, I know it's got its challenges, it's got its controversies, but data can not only provide examples of good practice that we can share, it can provide a framework for university leaders to understand how they can improve. It provides the reward and recognition for good practice, which I think is essential to demonstrate to governments and cynics about the incredible value of universities and their impact in society, their contribution to the SDGs. And it could provide the consumer power so that students can vote with their feet and make informed choices. So the power of data for me is fundamental to this. We do need to understand and measure and get a real handle on how universities are contributing and how they can be incentivized to contribute more.
Absolutely. And straight from that, maybe to a student viewpoint, Tanya, do you want to share your 30-second thought piece for people to bear in mind for the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm also extremely aware that I'm also coming at it from quite a specific, obviously, student/graduate point of view. But I think the main thing that I would want to take away from it, and someone's picked up on this from the audience as well, is that, we're saying, are universities credible? What can universities be doing? Is it possible? Can we adapt quickly enough? Well, we have to. I mean, I think universities that don't do that are absolutely going to be failing their students if they don't adapt in the next 10, 20, 30 years or whatnot, because I think their role is so key. And, we'll see obviously what shape exactly this adaptation takes, but I think the importance of just being adaptive, being flexible, and responding to student demands is sort of the key thing that I would take away from today.
Thank you, Tanya. And Tristan, straight on to you.
So I think one message I'd say is that we need to think about universities as protagonists again. It's great that higher education is back in the SDGs, wasn't there in the MDGs really. So that's wonderful. But I think we do need to think about the university's active role, not in the kind of arrogant way that perhaps the university has acted at some points, about sort of through its largesse, sharing its knowledge with those less fortunate, a different kind of relationship, one of dialogue, of horizontal relations, but nevertheless protagonism, with confidence in its ability to shape society for the better, and to create, not just adapting and changing to what's outside of it, but actually, forging helping achieving the SDGs, but also critiquing and creating new and better frameworks as well.
Absolutely. Aromar, do you want to share your thoughts?
So the SDGs are predicated on simultaneously dealing with three things: with people, prosperity, and the planet. That itself is a challenging thing to do simultaneously in 10 years. But there are also three other constraints that we often forget, and that is to leave no one behind, to leave no place behind, and to leave no ecosystem behind. Now, if this is not a moonshot challenge, then I don't know what a moonshot challenge is. So in a sense, universities are there to help us try and figure out in different parts of the world how we can make that possible. So that's, I guess, the research, the innovation side. But there's also the other part. If we have to do this in a generation or generation and a half, we have to have people who know how to do this. And that's the teaching part of what we're going to be doing. So it's bringing together those things in a sort of somewhat radical way. And that's why I said it's almost a 68 moment, because COVID is showing us that we have to make these changes at exponential scale, because the world is not waiting for us to make that happen. And I think that how do you enable the societal transition to make this real is the real interesting time. So it's a great time to be in universities, in spite of the strikes, in spite of all the other pressures that we have from various forces. And I think we can maybe make a little bit of a difference on this line.
Thanks, Aromar. It's a very powerful sign-off. And Duncan, I'll come to you, and you can round us off before you go to bed in Sydney.
How can I follow Arrow? Yeah, look, I mean, universities are very slow-moving, deeply conservative, deeply kind of vertical organizations. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And I do wonder if we're at one of these threshold moments for higher education. It's always a fallacy to think that you're at the center of these things. So maybe it's just one of those. But I really do think, for all the reasons that Arrow has pointed out, universities, without being arrogant, without over determining our role, have a really critical role to play in this complex set of challenges that we face. And I do think it means some fundamental challenges to the way that universities have operated for quite some time. And as I said earlier, unless we change, we just will be left behind. We will let down our students. We will let down the communities we serve. And we actually won't be able to contribute in the way that we need to. So I think the challenges the world faces, the opportunity the SDGs provide to think about our contribution to those challenges, and the things we need to do to respond will transform universities one way or another over the next 10 years. And I think that is another good reason why it's an extraordinary time for higher ed more generally.
Thanks so much to everyone. I have to wrap up now. I don't want to, but I have to. It's so fantastic to have all of you together. Thank you to the audience. Your feedback on what was missing is really useful. The social justice point we take on really strongly. It's important that we embed that much better in the work we do. Talking about how we can actually engage even better with you. So questions as comments as well as questions is all really, really helpful. So thank you. We've talked a lot today about, are we on the tipping point of something? Are we on a threshold moment? Is it a 1968 moment? Is remote learning going to lead to a new role for students, or for a new role for inter-global North and global South development, kind of developing projects together, developing work together, developing funding together? This is a really exciting time, I think, for everyone in this virtual room and beyond. And I think I think we should really maintain this momentum and keep asking these difficult questions now, because it's often at the heart of crisis that you have to ask difficult questions to dig deeper and to get to the ideas, the innovation, the output that you need to push through. Should higher education institutions address the SDGs? Yes, absolutely. Probably yes. There's a fundamentally important framework. It's a route to restructuring the way that we think, the way that we learn, the way that we teach, the way that we interact with our communities. And what should they do? We need to address our credibility. We need to genuinely walk the talk. We need to make more of our research. We need to communicate. We need to engage. We need to be open. We need to be porous. I love this idea of a porous university that is held to account, that invites people in. And we need kind of clearer strategies. We need living labs. We need all of these new and experimental ways of doing things. And we shouldn't be scared to open up our ways of working to this new way. And we need people like like Phil to hold us to account. We need people like Tanya to push us to go further as a recent graduate, and as the kind of the younger students come up into working with us. These are all just things that we can work with, that we need to learn from and experiment with. And so thank you so much for spending the time to work through this really important discussion with me, with UCL, with the Beyond Boundaries conference. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.